Welcome back to Wrong Sports, and the most prestigious individual trophy in college football is the Heisman Trophy. It is one of the most prestigious individual trophies in all of sports. It's also one of the most overrated trophies in all of sports, but I'm not going to go into that. Instead, this time, I'm going to be doing a list of the biggest Heisman snubs ever. These are the guys who I think should have won the Heisman Trophy over the person who actually won. And I'm going to be having a list of 9 in chronological order. I'm also going to be having about 4 or 5 honorable mentions. So I'm going to have about 15 guys mentioned here. So don't worry, I'm probably going to be mentioning every Heisman snub you can think of. If you can think of another one, tell me in the comments below. But before we get to the list, make sure as always you subscribe to the channel below, ring that bell so you can get updates on brand new videos, brand new lists that I will be dropping in the future. If you haven't already, please check out my Patreon and also subscribe to my Patreon, patreon.com/wrongsports. You can check out exclusive content and lists there. And one final thing, please like and share this video, share this channel with other college sports fans. So I'm going to get to the honorable mentions first, and I'm going to get to 3 guys from 1956 who probably should have won the Heisman Trophy. It's tough to have 6 touchdowns, so that might have been a reason why he didn't get as many votes as he probably should have. There was also the bias of voting on African-American players, which I'll get to for other athletes that I'll mention. Another guy who could have won in 1956 was Tommy McDonald. He led his team with 853 yards, 12 touchdowns. He also had 282 yards and 4 receiving touchdowns. He was on the national title undefeated Oklahoma team. Also, Johnny Majors, he came in second that year in the Heisman. He probably should have won too over the guy who won, which was Paul Hornung, who was on an awful Notre Dame team. And Paul Hornung won because he had the Notre Dame bias and also because he had the all-around player label, because he could run, he could catch, he could pass, he could kick. He was receiving kickoffs and punt returns. He was doing it all, so he kind of got the extra votes that way. And yeah, and of course the Notre Dame bias. Next up in honorable mentions is from 1937. Clint Frank of Yale won it that year, giving Yale 2 in a row out of the first 3 years in the Heisman Trophy. But Marshall Goldberg of Pitt or Byron Wizard White of Colorado had better seasons and should have won the Heisman that year. Goldberg first, he had nearly 900 rushing yards. He was also the leading passer on an undefeated Pitt team that were rated the national champion. Meanwhile, Wizard White had 1,100 rushing yards. He had 16 touchdowns. He was the clear best offensive player in college football in 1937, but both missed out on winning the Heisman Trophy. Wizard White obviously had a more distinguished career after football. This next guy I was going to put on my list, but I thought it was going to be a little too controversial because he was on a terrible team for both years that he ran for 2,000 yards. This is Troy Davis. Yes, he ran for 2,000 yards in back-to-back seasons, 15 touchdowns in 1995, then followed it up with 2,185 yards and 21 touchdowns, plus he had 5.4 yards per carry in 1996. But like I mentioned, those Iowa State teams were terrible. They went 5-17. And he really should have won the Heisman in 1996. He won 3 out of 4 regions, but lost the award to Danny Warfel of Florida, making it the first time a Heisman finalist won 3 out of 4 voting regions and didn't win the award. And this might have been because the South overwhelmingly gave their votes to Warfel, which just barely put him over the top. But Troy Davis definitely should have won this year. Finally, these next 2 guys are from the 2000s, so a lot of us will remember. Adrian Peterson had probably one of the best, if not the best, freshman season, and he probably should have won the Heisman in 2004, but he couldn't beat out Matt Leinart, who brought his USC team to the national championship. But Adrian Peterson had 1,900 yards. He set the freshman rushing record. He had 15 touchdowns, but freshmen rarely got awards for the Heisman, so he was the first to break that benchmark that this award could go to a freshman or a sophomore soon, so that was good. But also Jason White, who finished just below him, probably took votes away from him too. Also, some in the comments might wonder why I don't have Vince Young on my list, but it would have been really tough for me to reason why he should have won it in either 2004 or 2005. 2005 was obviously his best season, but Reggie Bush had a better season to me than Vince Young in 2005. But I think a lot of people are remembering the national championship game for Vince Young as a reason why he should have won the Heisman, except they give out the Heisman Award before the national title game. So if the award was given out after the national title game, then yes, I agree. Vince Young would have won this year instead of Reggie Bush. So right now, these are my official top 9 who should have won the Heisman Trophy. I'm going to go in chronological order, and I'm going to start it off with Johnny Bright. He was one of the first true dual-threat quarterbacks, and because of one violent act, his whole college football career ended. Johnny Bright was on Drake's football team from 1949 to 1951, and he led them to their highest of heights. In his sophomore year, he had nearly 1,000 passing yards and 1,000 rushing yards. That would be an introduction to his junior season, as in 1950, he should have won the Heisman, because he rushed for 1,232 yards, and he passed for 1,168 yards, setting an NCAA record for total offense. He didn't even make it into the top 10 in voting that year, obviously because of the bias against voting for an African-American player, like Jim Brown, like I mentioned before. But even though he didn't win it in 1950, he would start strong in 1951, as he threw for 1,300 yards and rushed for over 800 yards in his first 5 games. He was on his way to having over 3,000 passing yards and 1,500 rushing yards, which would have been a first by quite a margin. But then he suffered 2 brutal and illegal hits in a game versus Oklahoma State, which ended his season. Watching him makes it seem like he was the future, and he should have been the first African-American Heisman winner. But once again, in 1951, he didn't even finish in the top 6. And if you want to learn more about the Johnny Bright incident, I made a video about that in the link above, and I talk all about his stats and how he should have won the Heisman in either 1950 or 1951. At number 2 is Dick Bass. He was nicknamed the one-man show when he played for College of Pacific in 1958. In 1959, he would be an All-American in 1958, and this was the year I think he should have won the Heisman, as he led the nation with 1,361 rushing yards. He had 15 touchdowns, while the Heisman winner that year, Pete Dawkins, had half as many yards, and that includes his receiving and rushing yards total. Bass would kick off his 1958 season with 215 rushing yards and 1 touchdown in a win over Cal, who ended up going to the Rose Bowl that season. Pacific were 6-4, so they weren't a losing team, and they did play some bigger schools like California, Boston College, and Washington State, so there really wasn't any good reason for Bass not winning the Heisman in 1958. He did have a pretty good season in 1959, as he ran for over 700 yards, but he was injured for half that season, so his 1958 season should have been the season he won that Heisman. Number 3 is Jerry Rome. This might be a name you haven't heard of before, but this guy was a gunslinger when that term was still in its infancy. He started his career on SMU in 1961 before sitting out 1962 so he could transfer to University of Tulsa. And at Tulsa, he started with a great junior season, as he had just over 1,900 passing yards and 10 touchdowns. That would get him started for his senior season in 1964, where he passed for 2,870 yards and 32 touchdowns, which was unheard of in 1960. Not many guys were throwing over 20. And he only threw 4 interceptions that season too, which was incredible. Tulsa were 8-2 on the season. They won the Blue Bonnet Bowl over Ole Miss, but that happened after the Heisman voting, which might have helped him because he came in second behind Notre Dame's John Hort. Tulsa did play in the Missouri Valley Conference, which was very small at this point, and the best team he played that season was Arkansas, which they lost to. So maybe if they beat Arkansas, more votes might have been going to him, but still, being in a small conference didn't help him. But God, those stats are amazing for a guy in the 1960s. Number 4 is Ed Marinaro. You might know him if you were a fan of Blue Mountain State, but he was one of the more well-known players in college football in the 1970s. He played for Cornell from 1969 to 1971. In all 3 of those seasons, he ran for at least 1,400 yards, and he had a total of 50 touchdowns in those 3 seasons. He had his best season, though, in 1979, where he led all of college in rushing with 1,881 yards, as well as 24 touchdowns, and he did this in only 9 games. He finished just behind Pat Sullivan of Auburn by just about 150 votes. It was one of the closest in the history of the Heisman. Him playing in the Ivy League, which was getting de-emphasized from Division I-A to Division I-AA in the next couple of years, might have been the reason, but he should have won the Heisman this year. He also ran for over 4,000 yards in 3 years of college, and only a handful of guys have managed to do that before. Number 5 is a guy that you could argue could have won the Heisman in either 1991, 1992, or 1993. This is Marshall Faulk. He ran for over 1,400 yards and averaged 6 yards a carry all through these 3 seasons. He burst onto the college football scene as a freshman in 1991 because in his second game, he ran for 386 yards and 7 touchdowns, and ended that season with 1,429 yards and 23 touchdowns. The next season in 1992 was his best in terms of yards because he had 1,600 yards and only 15 touchdowns. Also, his team was just at 500. That might have been why he finished second behind Gino Tortoretta, who passed for only 19 touchdowns, but he was on the best team in Miami. In 1993, Faulk showcased his all-purpose ability by catching 47 passes for 640 yards and 3 touchdowns to go with his 1,530 yards on the ground and 21 touchdowns, but he finished 4th behind Charlie Ward. So that is why I said any one of those 3 years could have been when he would have won the Heisman. So that's why I said you could have picked either one of those years for him to win the Heisman. But like now, the Heisman voting is more concerned with picking the best player, mostly the best quarterback, from the best overall team instead of the best overall player, which Marshall Faulk was definitely in 1992. Number 6 is Air McNair, Steve McNair. That was the nickname that was given to him in the early 1990s when he was being an absolute gunslinger on Alcorn State. He already passed for over 9,000 yards in his first 3 years as a starter, but in his senior season of 1994, he completely blew apart defenses and records. He started the 1994 season with a 500-yard passing day versus Grambling, but they still lost 62-56. He would average 500 passing yards a game the rest of the season and helped Alcorn State go 8-2-1 and get to the Division I-AA playoffs, which was hard for an HBCU to do. In the 1994 season, he passed for 5,377 yards. He had 47 touchdown passes, but he also ran for 900 yards and 9 touchdowns. But yet, even with these gaudy stats and highlights, he came in 3rd behind the 2,000-yard rusher Rashaan Salaam. McNair could have been the first Division I-AA player to win the Heisman, and he had a great chance to win it because Salaam and Kajana Carter were seen to split the votes between them since they were both running backs, and many people thought that the quarterback was going to end up winning it. But in the end, it didn't work, even though it should have. And if you want to have some fun, watch one of these Alcorn State games from 1994. We're going to be in the 2000s now with Larry Fitzgerald. He lost in one of the closest Heisman votes in history, as Larry Fitzgerald had one of the best receiving years in the history of college football, as he had 1,672 receiving yards, 22 touchdowns, and made Pitt into a monster in 2004. Meanwhile, he lost the Heisman by only 128 votes to Jason White, who again only won it because he was a quarterback on the best team that year, even though Larry Fitzgerald was clearly the best player and should have won it this year. If you're wondering who was Jason White, you don't remember him because he didn't go to the NFL. He won the Heisman mostly due to having a fantastic offensive line at Oklahoma and because Bob Stoops is an absolute wizard at getting quarterbacks to win the Heisman Trophy. But what was more shocking this year was that Oklahoma looked terrible in the Big 12 title game and somehow got to the BCS national title game only to lose that too, yet Jason White still won the Heisman Trophy in between that span of losing 2 games, which was just really weird. Fitzgerald was everything to Pittsburgh in 2003 as he helped a mediocre team stay in a lot of games. Only thing I could think of that he didn't win the Heisman this year was that Oklahoma were pouring on the points versus opponents and inflating Jason White's stats, while Fitzgerald had to have every yard and every touchdown. And that is what the Heisman is supposed to be all about, finding the best player. At least that's what I think it's supposed to be about. And following up on that notion, this next guy is the guy that had an argument for being the best overall player, and he should have won the Heisman in either 2006 or 2007. This is Darren McFadden, and he was much closer in 2007 than in 2006, but I would have given him the Heisman in 2006. He was the absolute Swiss Army knife for Arkansas as he ran in touchdowns, caught touchdowns, returned kicks for touchdowns, and he also passed for 3 touchdowns in 2006. And he also had a 200-yard rushing game versus South Carolina. He helped Arkansas go to the SEC title game that year too, which was farther than they did the next year in 2007. He would become the only sophomore to win the Doak Walker Award and still somehow lost the Heisman Trophy by almost 2,000 votes to Troy Smith of Ohio State. Many people have said that this was the biggest snub of all time since Troy Smith's stats weren't blow-away great, and he was on the #1 team in college football that year. So again, that might have been a big reason why he won the Heisman, because everyone says a lot of Heisman voters don't even watch the games, they just pick the best player on the best team, and that's what Troy Smith was. McFadden wasn't on the best team, and that was what hurt him that year. He was a frontrunner in 2007 for the Heisman, but lost out to Tebow, and really he wasn't going to beat out Tebow that year, so that's why I said 2006 was the year he should have won. Rounding out my list is a guy who I think should have been the first defensive player, overall defensive player, to win the Heisman Trophy. It's Ndamukong Suh. I know that Charles Woodson was a predominantly defensive player, but he did return kickoffs. He also took some passes, so that was a big reason why he won the Heisman Trophy in 1997. Ndamukong Suh was pure defense. This guy, though, did everything for Nebraska. And recently, he was one of the few defensive players that actually had a chance to win the Heisman Trophy. He led a fantastic Nebraska defense that finished at the top or near the top nationally in most defensive categories. The defense only gave up 20 points or more twice and lost 3 games that year by 1 point, showing how close they were to winning the Big 12 and a potential national championship too. Ndamukong Suh would have a total of 20 tackles for losses and 12 sacks plus 1 interception in 2009, and he did this while being double-teamed. Due to him total tackles, 6 of them for losses, and if it wasn't for a late call giving Texas a last-second field goal, all time in the Heisman, as the top 4 were within 500 points, with Mark Ingram winning the award over Toby Gerhart of Stanford by only 28 total points, and Mark Ingram was only 4 first-place votes ahead of Gerhart. And usually a close vote, especially between guys who play the same position, which Gerhart and Ingram did, usually it helps an outsider, like it did with Charles Woodson in 1997, except it didn't help Suh this year. He did get very close, but he couldn't win the Heisman that year. He should have won it this year, though. And there you have it. There is my top 9 Heisman snubs in the history of college football, plus a few other honorable mentions. Tell me who else you think I'm missing. I mean, I did mention like 15 guys right there. So, I mean, I might be missing a few others, but tell me who else you think in the comments below. Also, make sure, as always, if you are not already, subscribe to the channel. Tell others to subscribe to this channel. Share this channel as well. And check out my Patreon, patreon.com/wrongsports.